Well, I guess we'll get started here. So hello everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of a series of 8 for the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online adaptation communities of practice. And those are run by us here at OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources. And we're located at Laurentian University in Sudbury, Ontario. So the way the webinar will run is as follows. So after this short introduction, we'll have the main presentation, which will go for about 40 or 45 minutes. And then at the end of the webinar, we're going to have some time left for any questions that you might have for the presenter. So if you have any questions during the webinar, we just ask that you please hold them until the end. And before we get going, I just have a few housekeeping items to go over. So first, for those of you who dialed into the conference call line, your lines have been automatically muted. And the reason for this is just to avoid any audio distractions, feedback, etc. during the webinar. So to ask a question during the Q&A session, all you'll have to do is dial *6 and that will unmute lines. But again, please keep your lines muted during the presentation. Also, you'll notice that there's a chat box on the left-hand side of your screen. You can use this chat box to field any questions that you might have for the presenter during the question and answer period. As well, if you have any technical difficulties during the webinar, you can also use this chat area to type your message, or you can click or hover over my name and there's an option to send me a private message, and then I can try to help as best as I can. I also want to mention that we are recording the webinar today, and I'll be sending out a copy of the recording to all of those who have pre-registered with me, and we'll also be posting it to the Community of Practice website. Finally, I know we have some people on the line today who may not be familiar with what the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice, or the FACOP, is. So I wanted to take this opportunity to quickly mention that it's an interactive online community, and it's dedicated to those who are working in forestry or who are interested in forestry and climate change adaptation in Canada. It includes features such as news articles, events, an online library, discussion forums, and much more. And it's free to join. So if there's anyone on the line today who's interested in learning more about the FACOP, please click on the link in the chat box for more information and to register. So with that being said, we're very excited to have Caren Dymond on the line with us today to talk about diversifying managed forests to increase resilience. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenter, Caren is a forest ecologist and has a background in carbon modeling, natural disturbances, ecological modeling, and geomatics. She has a Master of Science degree and a Bachelor of Science degree in ecology from the University of Calgary and is a professional agrologist. After finishing her master's, Caren started her career in a landscape ecology lab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Since then, she worked for the Canadian Forest Service on various projects over 8 years. Joining the BC Forest Service in 2008 as a research scientist, Caren works on accounting and forecasting the carbon and greenhouse gas dynamics of BC's forests, lands, and harvested wood products. So on behalf of everyone joining us, I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to you, Caren, for taking the time to present this webinar for us today. It's very much appreciated. So without further ado, I will now turn things over to you.
Thanks, Annette. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you. Thanks.
Excellent. And thanks, everybody, for coming to this webinar. I appreciate having an audience. So this is a project that my work group in the BC Forest Service has undertaken. Interdisciplinary, so you'll get to see some forestry, forest management, some ecology, and some economics. So the goals of the project were to identify opportunities to adapt to climate change. So a few years ago, a report came out recommending that the BC government work and forest sector work towards creating more resilient forests to deal with the uncertainty of climate change. And it identified a number of risks to the ecological goods and services that we depend on as a society. But that report was kind of very high level, and what we wanted to do is take that down a notch and into something more closer to the operational forest management. So the one aspect of resilience that we've explored is is the ecological theory that increasing species diversity increases the ecosystem resilience. And I'll talk about more about that in the next slide. But our goal in this project was to evaluate how we might implement that and how much would it cost. Because we were coming from the common assumption, or shared the common assumption, that climate change adaptation is expensive, or at least will cost more than what we're currently doing. And part of the goals of this project was to leverage the mountain pine beetle epidemic, which is a climate change impact I hope you've heard about, where over 18 million hectares in BC has been affected to some degree. And so we wanted to ask, well, can we use this event to learn how to better manage our forest in the future? So resiliency, the definition we're using is on the slide there. But it's about how, when you have a shock to the system, how does the system respond, and does it change, let's say, from a forest to a grassland as a result of that shock? Or is it resilient, and does it recover and still continue to be a forest? And resiliency isn't just an ecological concept. It's in the social sciences. It's in economics. It's a general theory, I guess I would say. And one aspect that may contribute to the resiliency is diversity. So you can think of it like a investment portfolio. You wouldn't put all your retirement savings into the stocks of Google, let's say, just because they're growing rapidly. You might put some into Google, some into your favorite bank, some into GIC. So you have a diversity of investments that allows your portfolio to be more resilient to shock to the marketplace. So it's a similar idea in terms of forest health, pests and disease, drought, and having a diversity of species that will be able to withstand forest health outbreaks. In this study, we were also interested in the targeted removal of high-risk species from a forest health perspective. So basically, in the photos there are two stands affected by mountain pine beetle. The one on the left, very low diversity, both in terms of species and in terms of age class. And the one on the right has greater diversity, and you can see that it's going to have a more resilient, be more resilient in terms of provision of ecological goods and services. Oops. Okay, I won't do too long on methods because I know everybody hates them, but there's a few key things I'd like to explain. So the study area is the Merritt timber supply area in the south central part of BC, generally dry and cold climate. So this is a modeling study where we use simulation modeling starting in 1980 and going through to 2060. This is a historical retrospective, as I explained, to try to leverage lessons learned from the mountain pine beetle epidemic. So we went back as far as we could get good data, and that was now in 1980. And then simulated different management strategies starting in 1980 and going up to 2060 through the beetle outbreak and out to 2060. By going out that far, it gives us the trees that are planted in the first couple of decades of the simulation a chance to become merchantable and to see sort of a rotation or a couple of rotations through the system. We tried as much as possible to use a modeling approach that would be familiar to forestry. So what's often used for timber supply modeling and determining AAC, helping determine AAC, annual allowable cut, or silviculture strategies in the province. So the management strategies we had are business as usual, which is just what it sounds, based on historical statistics and what's in the planning document. A mixed planting that had a similar harvest schedule to the business as usual, but instead of, but had more diversity in the planting of the clear cut. And then the third, more aggressive strategy was targeting pine early in the harvest, planting mixed species in the clear cut, as well as doing more natural regeneration through partial harvesting. So this is the forest inventory from 1980. So this is the standing live volume of trees by species. And you can see it's heavily dominated by lodgepole pine. So species diversity, there's kind of two aspects to it. One is simply the count of the species, and the other is the relative abundance. So this landscape in 1980 is a low diversity landscape. So from a resilience perspective, you would expect it to have low resilience to forest health problems. So the management strategies, the harvest, we use the same volume harvested for the first 3 decades for all the different strategies. But the business as usual strategy, so what's the licensees actually harvested, of the volume harvested, about 40% was pine. So even though, as you saw in the last slide, like 70 or 80% of the standing volume was pine, they preferentially harvested spruce and Douglas fir. In the mixed planting scenario, we did the same. We told the model to follow the same pattern, so predominantly clear cuts and actively selecting away from pine. In the EMR strategy, remember that E was for early pine cut. So we told the model to preferentially harvest pine. Something, if you looked at that landscape and said this is a low resilience landscape, we want to be proactive and reduce the abundance of pine, that's the strategy, the EMR strategy that we took. The other management activity that we changed was the regeneration. So business as usual is the red bar, and about 70% of the area to be planted would be planted in, was planted as lodgepole pine, and that is continued in the current planning documents for the study area. However, given the site conditions, we were able to lower that in our alternative strategies to about 30%. So there's still some areas, this is a cold and dry climate, there's still some areas that all you can do with the clear cut is plant 100% lodgepole pine. We're not saying lodgepole pine is big men. We're not saying people shouldn't plant it. We're just saying we don't have to be planting it as much as is currently being done under the business as usual strategy. So we're able to diversify by changing the relative abundance in the regeneration and also by adding species. So primarily, well, the one new species we add to the landscape is western larch. So it's not currently there, but it is consistent with the Chief Forester's guidance on regeneration that western larch can be planted in this study area. Okay, the economic analysis was led by my co-author, Sinclair Tedder. We did multiple discount rates and analyzed revenues and costs. So this is log value at the mill, and costs such as hauling, harvesting, and planting. And something that's a little bit different from the typical forest economic analysis is we consider the whole study area as a unit. So in year 1, you have expenditures, but you'll also have revenue coming in over time. So it's closer to sort of an operational economic analysis than the traditional analysis where you start with bare ground, you do some silviculture, and then you have to wait till the harvest in some future when the stand has become mature. Okay, on to the fun stuff. So the first question is, can management activities change the diversity, tree species diversity of the landscape? And so this slide answers that question. This is a diversity index that takes into account both the species richness, or the number of species, and the relative abundance. And what you see at the beginning is all three landscapes have the same diversity. And over time, under the business as usual scenario, that diversity becomes lower. Because remember, the licensees are preferentially harvesting spruce and Douglas fir and primarily planting pine. The mixed planting scenario does increase the diversity, creating a more resilient forest. But the EMR scenario increases the diversity faster because it has that target harvesting of lodgepole pine. And the 2000 to 2009 period right in here, that's when the mountain pine beetle hits. So this is the standing growing stock, or the live tree volume on the landscape. So again, starting in 1980, they're all the same, and then the beetle hits. And you can see it has a devastating impact on the live tree volume in all the scenarios. But the EMR scenario has the greatest survivorship through the beetle outbreak. And so we're using that as an indicator that this was a more resilient forest. The mixed planting scenario has a poor survivorship, or a lower growing stock than the business as usual here. And that's because the pine in the climate grows really quickly. So if in business as usual you're planting pine, you're getting higher growth rates and faster recovery at post-beetle than in the mixed planting. And the young pine stands aren't affected by the beetle, it's the mature stand. So harvest rate is, of course, another important indicator for forestry. So remember, we told the model to use the same volume harvested per year for the first 3 decades. This is when we had data. This surge in harvest in 2000 to 2009 was the result of a government policy to try to capture as much of the value of the forest as possible in response to the threat from the beetle. Post-beetle, we projected the highest possible harvest rate that could be supported by the growing stock you saw in the previous slide and still be constrained by the normal regulatory constraints, such as a certain amount of old growth forest on the landscape and that sort of thing. So the highest harvest rate post-beetle was in the EMR scenario because it had the highest growing stock, highest survivorship. But these 3 different harvest rates post-beetle are not all that different. This is a 1 million hectare area, so they're not, some people would consider them to be not different. But remember, the black line has higher resilience. Another consideration is the age class distribution. And this may be more indicative of resilience for other species who require old growth. But the EMR scenario has more old growth stands because it didn't take quite the same hit from the beetle and the logging response to the beetle. So if we look at the economics, we went into this assuming that any sort of adaptive approach would cost more, but it turns out that the net present value for the EMR scenario was highest. It was the highest net present value across the 80-year simulation under the discount rates that we looked at anyways. If we look at the annual net revenue, on the left here, there's this is the annual net revenue. On the right is the differential from business as usual. So in 1980, you can see that the EMR scenario has a lower net revenue than either mixed plant or business as usual. And then the spike is again the result of the surge in harvesting. And post-beetle, you can see the black line is a little bit higher. And this is under a 3% discount rate. If we look at the differential, it's a little easier to see what's going on. So there's lower revenues or opportunity costs for the first decade. After that, the EMR scenario is more profitable than business as usual, which is along the zero line here. The mixed planting scenario has lower profitability than business as usual, just until the very end. And what's happening here, if you remember, the business as usual is predominantly planting pine, and pine is not as valuable as Douglas fir in our modeling variables and parameters here. But in the mixed planting, so by the end of the simulation, in business as usual, all there is to harvest on the landscape is pine. In the mixed planting, by the end of the simulation, the Douglas fir, that is a more valuable log that we planted in the beginning of the simulation, becomes merchantable. And so the higher costs of mixed planting are being overcome by the higher value of the logs once they become available to harvest. Cost, lots of people in the forest industry are focused on cost first and foremost. And what we found is in the first few decades, the costs were much lower in the early pine cuts, more natural regen and mixed planting scenario. And that includes taking into account higher costs of mixed planting that you see where the green line is above business as usual here. So what's going on with these first decade economics? So we have the same volume being harvested in business as usual and EMR, but the revenues were lower under EMR. Net revenues are lower. And that was because both the revenues were lower, but also the costs are lower. So what's going on in some more detail here is the cost categories in decade one. So when we instructed the model to preferentially harvest pine, it ended up harvesting many fewer hectares per year in that first decade because there were some high volume stands that the licensees had not harvested, but instead had gone for the Douglas fir spruce. And so the model was able to harvest the volume we required in many fewer hectares. So the planting costs were quite a bit lower. And then with the partial harvesting does cost more, but then there's more natural regen, which is less expensive. So the cost side is a little bit complicated. The revenue side was lower because the pine logs are only valued at $49 per cubic meter instead of $67 per cubic meter. And we had that change in species mix in that first decade. Okay, so that's Merritt in some detail. We have a paper published describing that study thoroughly, I hope. I have a link on the last slide. We did a similar study in the Kamloops timber supply area, and we are working at getting this one published, but I'll give you a preview here. So Kamloops is the timber supply area, is just north of the Merritt area, but the climate is more variable. So there's what we call the interior wet zone. It has more western red cedar, moist soil, as well as some very dry and cooler, more pine type climate. So the landscape as a whole is more diverse. This is a 1980 inventory again, and remember from Merritt it was almost entirely lodgepole pine. Well, here you can see in Kamloops study area, it's more diverse, even in the beginning before we try apply any management action. So similar management strategies where we had business as usual. In this study area, the pine was about 18% of the harvested volume in 1980 to 1989. Mixed planting, again, we kept the same. And the EMR, we said, told the model to preferentially select pine, and it was able to make up the harvest volume with 91% pine. Regeneration, oh dear, I'm sorry, I didn't rearrange the labels on this slide. So the labels, species labels at the bottom are wrong. So this is Douglas fir here, and that makes up a large proportion of the regeneration in all scenarios. Pine does make up a greater proportion of regeneration under business as usual than under our other scenarios, but the scale is different here than in Merritt. So in Merritt, pine was 40% of the area being planted, whereas here, even under business as usual, about 35%. So the licensees are taking a more diverse approach to regeneration in this landscape before we come and muck about with alternative management scenarios through our research. Okay, I'll just kind of hit on some of the highlights where the Kamloops study results are different from Merritt. So remember, the first question we were asking is, can forest management activities change landscape scale diversity? And in Kamloops, we found very little impact. So at the beginning, the EMR scenario was able to increase the diversity somewhat. Whether or not this would be enough to make a difference, we'll see. And then by the end of the scenario, you can see business as usual starting to pull away with a lower diversity than either of the alternatives. But it's simply not as dramatic as what we saw in Merritt, which makes it more complicated to explain, but also more interesting. Live tree volume. So again, the graph on the left is the one you saw before from 1980. By 2000, the management scenarios were able to reduce the amount of high-risk species on the landscape. So the high-risk species in this case, because we know the beetle is coming, is lodgepole pine. So the EMR scenario is able to lower the amount of high risk, creating a potentially more resilient landscape. The mixed planting is not able to affect the landscape scale composition quite so quickly. So this is pre-beetle. So what happened is that when we do the harvest surge, remember that was a policy decision in response to the threat to the beetle, allowed the surge in harvest. Well, under the EMR scenario, we didn't need that because we had changed the landscape composition and reduced the risk to that degree. If we told the model to harvest the same volume in this decade, it wasn't harvesting so much pine, it was harvesting spruce. Whereas under BAU and mixed planting, it was harvesting quite a bit of pine, which reflects a lot of what's happened operationally as well. So this is one of the big differences in the results between Merritt and Kamloops, is this we likely would have made a different policy decision if the landscape had looked more like the EMR landscape in 2000 than it did. So that's what we ended up simulating feeling it was unrealistic that there would have been the same surge in harvest. And so what that means, you can probably predict, is that there's much higher growing stock post-beetle. So this is substantially different graphs than what we saw in Merritt, where the EMR scenario, there's quite a bit more growing stock. There's even a little bit more growing stock before the beetle hits, but then much higher growing stock later. So again, we're taking that as an indication that the landscape is more resilient. So just going back to look at the post-beetle harvest, the mixed planting regime had no effect on the post-beetle harvest rate that we could achieve on that landscape. However, the EMR was quite a bit higher, about 500,000 cubic meters a year higher in the long term. Oops. Okay, so what does that mean for net revenue? Well, again, because there's this fundamental change in the harvest dynamics, the net revenue story is a little bit more complicated. So you can see in mixed planting and business as usual, there was a peak in net revenue in the 2000 to 2009 because of that surge in harvest. And that becomes, when we look at it as a differential, that becomes less profitable decade than business as usual. But post-beetle revenues are much higher because of the higher harvest rate and the emphasis on more valuable species in the regeneration scenario. And if you sum them up, the net present value over the simulation was highest for the EMR scenario. Okay, so that's just a brief touch on CAMIBs. We did do sensitivity analysis. We looked at how the results might change if the Douglas fir growth rate was higher or lower than we had used in the projections. And we looked at what happened if the log price changed, higher or lower. And you can read about the detail in the publication, but what we found was that the ranking of the different management scenarios remained the same. So there were robust results. So our conclusions are that we have to challenge our own assumptions. And I was describing this project in its early stages to my director. He thought you'd have to start harvesting pine in the 50s to make a difference. And other people thought you wouldn't be able to even make a difference. And so we thought, well, let's try. Other people think all we have to do is plant mixed species, and we will achieve more resilient forest. Well, we may or may not. It depends on what you're starting with and how far out the forest health problems may occur. And of course, we had the assumption that this was all going to be very expensive. Well, maybe not. It depends on, are you looking out to the next quarter, the next year, the next decade, the next generation? I saw an invitation list that many of you are working in climate change adaptation already, so you're already thinking beyond current practices. But we do have to take these situations on a case-by-case basis. So in forestry, it's always dependent on your site types and your landscape, your climate, and your the history, of course, land use history, as well as the socioeconomic dependencies on the ecosystem. So one size isn't going to fit all. I think we've beaten that to the ground. Yeah, less risk does not mean no risk. So I like to say everybody's somebody's in it. So this isn't really about pine, although it certainly is in the case of the mountain pine beetle outbreak. But it's about all tree species are susceptible to different pest, disease, drought, or just maladaptation. So there's always going to be some risk. What we're trying to ask in this study is, can we affect that risk? All right, so there's my contact information and Sinclair's. And as I mentioned, the Merritt article is published and it's open access at CJFR. That's it.
Okay, great. Thanks, Caren. So we do have some time left for questions. So if you have any questions or comments, we welcome you to please type those out into the chat box on the left. And then we can read them out loud for everybody. And if you're on the conference call line with us and would prefer to ask a question over the phone, all you have to do is hit *6 and that will unmute your line. So I don't see anybody typing just yet on the chat box. Is there anybody on the conference call line that has a question or a comment for Caren? If so, just go right ahead. Give everybody a few seconds here. Okay, if not, I have a question, Caren. So why wouldn't we just use climate change impact modeling to select the appropriate species to plant?
Well, I think if we have climate impact modeling that we consider credible, then certainly we can do that. If there's indications that an area is going to become more drought prone, then it would be appropriate to introduce more species that are drought tolerant. But I find that the climate projections, especially for precipitation, are highly variable and inconclusive. And so it's very difficult to predict the future climate, let alone how species will or provenances will respond to that climate, let alone how pests and disease are going to respond to those responses. So we're working with such a complex system with forestry that what we tried to do in this study is say, well, how can we create a more resilient ecosystem, given that we don't know what the future is going to bring. All we know is that it's not going to look like the past. That's the only thing we can say for certain. The only thing I can say for certain, that's for sure. So we shouldn't do nothing and wait for the climate change impact modeling to be solid. We can do things now. Everything we've done in this study fits within current regulations and guidance in BC. So we're not moving in exotic species or you know, some of those things are being undertaken under research or pilot studies, a lot of different adaptation strategies. But this type of thing we could implement now with a no regret kind of approach.
Okay, thank you. If there's any more questions, I don't see that anybody is typing. Usually we can see. So I'll ask the conference call line again one last time. If there's any questions on the conference call line, just hit *6. Okay, well, you must have answered all of your questions in your presentation. Look at that. Okay, well, if there aren't any questions, I'd like to thank everybody for joining us today for the FACOP webinar. We hope you enjoyed it. And a very big thank you goes out to you, Caren, for your time and your effort and for a great and informative presentation. So are there any last comments from you before we sign off here?
No, just thanks everybody for attending. And feel free to contact myself or Sinclair.
That's what I was just going to ask, if they can send you an email if they have any further questions or anything like that. So that's great. Okay, well, thanks again, everybody, and to Caren, and everybody have a great week.